Former CCP leader Jiang Zemin is dead, but his terrible legacy lives on, and it's helping police crack down on mass protests. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Surfshark. Whenever you go online, especially to look into what's happening in China right now, you should be using a VPN like Surfshark to protect your identity. So, former Chinese leader Jiang Zemin is dead at age 96. Or, as I've been waiting to say for 10 years, the toad has finally croaked. I mean, I really didn't think he was going to hang on this long, but it turns out you can live a long time if you've got the right motivation. In Jiang's case, it was taking down his political enemies. Now, normally when someone dies in their mid-90s, you can say, well, he led a good life. But in Jiang Zemin's case, let's just say he led a long life. Now, if you look at the media reports on Jiang's death, you might be misled into thinking that he wasn't actually a bad guy. They call Jiang Zemin a tough-talking reformer who guided China's economic rise, led China's boom after Tiananmen, and guided China into global markets. No matter how much Jiang gets referred to as a reformer, he certainly never made any political reforms, unless you count letting rich people into the Chinese Communist Party. He did do that. Jiang was the unelected president of the Chinese government from 1993 to 2003. And when these articles talk about what a great reformer he was, what he really did was convince foreigners to invest in China, while allowing them to believe that the Chinese Communist Party would definitely make political reforms too, just as soon as the country is rich enough. I mean, sure, that was a lie, but it was a lie people wanted to hear, so they could make lots of money in China. Speaking of making money, Jiang also convinced America to get China into the World Trade Organization, which led American businesses to start manufacturing cheap goods in China in exchange for transforming America into this. But don't worry, because Jiang knew exactly what to do with all the foreign money being pumped into China. Make sure the Communist Party gets rich. His rule over the party fostered a huge culture of corruption, in which party members and their relatives became millionaires and even billionaires. What a reformer! But I don't want to be too harsh on Western media, because most of the articles on Jiang at least dedicated one or maybe even two sentences to all the terrible human rights atrocities he carried out, like jailing human rights, labor, and pro-democracy activists, and banning the Falun Gong spiritual movement. In order to pursue his crackdown on Falun Gong, Jiang expanded China's security state. Not only did it help him keep a grip on power, but it established the systems that eventually led to the persecution of the Uyghurs, and even China's zero COVID lockdowns. It's nice to know even after a person dies, his terrible legacy lives on. Strangely, none of the reports mentioned how Jiang also started the practice of organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience, as in killing people so they can sell their organs. People like Tibetans, Christians, Falun Gong, and Uyghurs. Kind of ironic that Jiang died of multiple organ failure. But why focus on all the horrific things that Jiang did when the media can focus on his colorful personality instead? He quoted the Gettysburg Address. He sang in public. He danced the cha-cha to Love Me Tender. What a swell guy. Okay, I get it. Jiang is a walking meme. It's fun to make fun of him. But there's a weird amount of nostalgia for Jiang in the good old days of the CCP. But there were no good old days of the CCP. While Jiang was running around quoting the Gettysburg Address, the CCP was, again, murdering people and selling their organs. Let's not forget that. And after the break, Jiang's death leaves Chinese leader Xi Jinping in a tricky spot. Welcome back. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is probably not terribly sad about Jiang Zemin's death. Fans of the people's favorite communist soap opera, General Hostility, know that Jiang and Xi have been locked in a power struggle for years now. In fact, I hear General Hostility will have a very special episode next week on Jiang's death and what it means for the CCP power struggle. Spoiler alert, just because he's dead doesn't mean it's over. Get the popcorn ready. But Jiang's death comes at a tricky time for Xi Jinping, after a weekend of protests against Xi's zero-COVID lockdowns. The last time protests erupted across China was back in 1989, when the death of former CCP official Hu Yaobang triggered the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy protests, which eventually spread across the country. Now, Jiang Zemin is not as popular as Hu Yaobang was, but Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are probably worried about a repeat. So they have to figure out how to let people mourn Jiang without triggering more protests. As of this recording, there have been no large-scale protests related to Jiang's death. But some people have been using tributes to Jiang online to complain about or criticize Xi Jinping's rule. And these tributes have been censored. Again, kind of ironic since Jiang also helped create China's massive internet censorship apparatus. That's how, after some pretty major protests against COVID lockdowns last week, most of it was quickly censored online. Some of the footage is up on Twitter, since Twitter is not under China's control. I think. But the massive amount of censorship makes it hard to know just how much of the protests are still going on. We do know that there were still protests in parts of Guangzhou earlier this week. But heavy police presence in other cities are making sure no new protests break out. On Tuesday, a planned protest in Shenzhen was canceled after large numbers of police turned up at several locations in the city. And more protests in Beijing and Shanghai have been stopped as well. Fortunately, there's so much footage, photos, and content about the protests that did happen that it stretched China's censorship to its limits. Videos of the marches and rallies have continued to surface on Chinese sites such as WeChat, a chat app, and the short video sharing app Douyin. Experts say the sheer volume of video clips has most likely overwhelmed the automated software and armies of censors. Protesters are doing clever things like flipping protest footage on its side, or using filters, or shooting video of video. That's how you beat the machines. And some of the protests themselves are subversive. In some places, people have just been holding up blank white pieces of paper. It's a symbol of how everyone is being censored. But if the paper says nothing, there's also nothing to censor, right? Just kidding. Police in some cities have been rounding up people who held up paper or who posted videos of protests, in some cases taking them to the police station and making them sign a promise not to do it again. Like one 19-year-old student who says he was summoned by police for questioning after he said in a group chat that he wanted to put up blank pieces of paper in public restrooms. Putting up blank pieces of paper in public restrooms. Clearly, this man must be stopped. And in addition to rounding up protesters, the Chinese Communist Party is falling back on another familiar strategy, blaming the protests on hostile foreign forces. China's ruling Communist Party has vowed to resolutely crack down on infiltration and sabotage activities by hostile forces. It's such a familiar strategy that even the protesters themselves were making fun of it. This is from a protest that happened over the weekend in Beijing, when someone tried to warn protesters to not be taken advantage of by foreign forces. But the protesters weren't buying it.
现在在我们的群众当中有境外反华势力在我们的周围。您这边请。你说的境外势力是马克思和恩格斯吗？是马克思和恩格斯吗？是斯大林吗？是列宁吗？马克思怎么跟你们说？因为新疆大火是境外势力放的吗？不是，请问贵州的大巴是境外势力推翻的吗？我真的完完全全认同你们说的。大家伙是境外势力叫来的吗？不是。我们连网都上不到国外的，我们哪儿来的境外势力？我们现在是能出国，还是能上国外的网？都不能。他们怎么联系我们？联系不上。哪儿来的境外势力？月球吗？
Well, I don't think there's anything the foreign forces can add to that. But maybe, just maybe, these protests are actually accomplishing something. This week, two Chinese cities, Guangzhou and Chongqing, announced they would ease some of the COVID restrictions. But in announcing the lifting of lockdowns, authorities in Guangzhou did not mention the protests, and the district where Tuesday's violence flared remained under tight control. So maybe the change in policy is just a coincidence? Meanwhile, in the city of Zhengzhou, where workers at an iPhone plant protested last week, officially lifted its citywide lockdown, only to replace it with curbs on hundreds of buildings and apartment blocks. So a promise of reform without actually changing anything. Jiang Zemin would be proud. And this episode is sponsored by Surfshark. When you go online, everything you do is being tracked and logged by the websites you visit and your internet service provider, and in many cases, by your government. And if you're in a country that censors social media, you'll need a VPN like Surfshark to be able to post stuff to Twitter, like important protest footage or snarky comments about people you hate. But no matter where you live or what you do online, you should always be keeping your internet activity private with a VPN. And Surfshark now has servers in over 100 countries, more than any other VPN. So that makes your connection faster and more reliable. Plus, Surfshark has top-of-the-line encryption and a no-logs policy, meaning they don't collect your browsing data. So check out Surfshark. With just one Surfshark account, you can connect as many devices as you want. So try it out now. Surfshark has a special deal that includes 83% off a 2-year plan, plus 3 extra months for free. You can protect yourself for just $221 a month. So go to surfshark.com/uncensored and use the code uncensored to secure this deal. The link is in the description below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.